Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Do you believe in God?
Never met him.
Yeah, well, I do. And I love Jesus' style,
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm here with Chad Gross. Chad, how you doing today?
Doing well. Enjoying the summer, enjoying the weather, even though it is hot here in Hagerstown, Maryland. We're making our way the only way they know how, or the only way we know how. But of course, that's just a little bit more than the law will allow. Are you allowed to quote Dukes of Hazzard anymore? Is that even allowed? Did I just get canceled? Okay, anyway, so I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Probably sorry you did now. But anyway.
Yeah.
How about you?
Great.
How are you?
Can you just put down your Confederate flag?
Hey, man, this is Roscoe P. Coltrane out on Possum Holler Road. I got the Duke boys in hot pursuit.
Don't worry, I'll hit him off at the pass. Right. On the Old Mill Road.
Enos, what are you doing? Okay.
No way. I apologize to our listeners. This was not scripted, obviously.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Too much coffee. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Today we're going to be talking about Jesus. We've got a great guest today, our friend Tom Gilson. We'll be talking to him a bit about his background during the interview, but one thing about Tom is that he's what I call like an old school apologetics blogger. Chad, you know what I mean by old school apologetics blogger?
I do. Like when apologetics really started to take off, he was there from the beginning.
Yeah. He was a permanent fixture, like he's there, he's out there blogging. So back in 2004 at his Thinking Christian blog, that's where I started seeing his stuff. Chad, you and I started blogging probably like 2007 or so.
Right.
But he's been there writing blog posts and taking names for a while.
Yeah, I actually heard Tom do another interview, and it was really funny. The person who was interviewing him said, he said what year Tom started blogging, and I can't remember what year it was, but the interviewer said, did they even have the internet back then? And I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, years in internet or blogging, it must be something like dog years, where you have to multiply by 5 or something, your internet age. Anyway, Tom Gilson, he's an author and a speaker. He's the senior editor and ministry coordinator for The Stream. The Stream was launched to equip Christians to think clearly about moral, political, and economic issues of the day, so you can find it over at stream.org. But today we're going to be talking to Tom about his new book, Too Good to Be False: How Jesus' Incomparable Character Reveals His Reality. I had a great read through this book. Loved it. There was a lot of reviews that I've heard where people are saying like, oh, wow, this gives me a appreciation and a sense of worship for Jesus in reading it. And I have to say that's absolutely true. If you're listening and you're looking for a different kind of book, this is, not your standard fare apologetics. It is apologetics, but it's like so Jesus-centric. I love it. And if you're watching like The Chosen while you're reading this, it's even better.
Yeah, so anytime somebody is offering fresh insight into the life of Christ, I'm interested, especially when it is something that exalts his deity and his character. And I'm excited to talk to him. This book has generated responses from the skeptical community, such as like Apologia, or even the Unitarians like Dale Tuggy. But then also people like Craig Evans, New Testament scholar, have actually said of this book that it's written toward a layman level, but that even specialists and experts will get something out of it. And so it really reaches a large amount of people. And I'm excited to talk to him about Jesus's character and why this is, and this idea that we should not only focus on what Jesus did, but we should also focus on what he didn't do and what we can learn from that.
Well, it's awesome. A couple things I got was that, made me, as I kind of mentioned there, it made me think all about Jesus and how awesome he is. Mm. But number two, it made me realize you can't make this stuff up. It's like, when you think about it, how could legendary accretion create the most compelling figure in history, And we'll get into that as we go to the interview, but let's roll into it now.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Tom Gilson, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, for those who may not be familiar with you and your writings, can you tell us a bit about your background and what sort of work you do at the moment?
Sure. I am a senior editor with The Stream at stream.org. We are a major, I would say, national website offering a Christian perspective on current events. We've got a great team there, small team, but we're trying to help people keep thinking Christianly about what's going on in the world. Well, along with that, I also have another kind of a side opportunity. I do podcast editing for Discovery Institute, ID the Future, the podcast. Before that, I was in senior national leadership with Ratio Christi for a couple of years, and prior to that, 34 years on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now Cru. Everything, I joke that I've lived more lives than a Buddhist because I've done everything from music to recording engineering to human resource leadership to strategies to apologetics. So it's been fun. I've got 2 kids, and they're both married, 1 grandson. My wife and I live near Dayton, Ohio.
Well, you forgot to mention the fact that you've run the sound for Sting and the Police as well.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot that part. That's in my book. And,
What?
Yeah. Well, that was the part where I was pulling a little game on everybody. Yeah, I do have a little bit of history there. I have run sound for Grammy and Dove award-winning artists, but not them. So,
well, for those who are wondering where that's coming from, there's a great little story in the book.
It does include meeting Sting in a locker room of all places.
Yes, yes, there is some truth to that.
That part's true.
Well, I remember we were saying before the podcast we started recording. Last time we met up, it was in Dundee, Michigan, at Bob Evans, and yeah. I think I remember you saying during that breakfast. You mentioned this idea at the time, and for me, it kind of came across like this Anselmian ontological argument for Jesus, almost like, the greatest story ever told must also be true, and we were you kind of had been kicking that idea around, and now, I've many times come back to that thought, like, yeah, it works. Wait, does it work? But it seems to me that this book is sort of like the culmination of that seed in a similar form, but wow, it's an amazing book. So, but can you talk a bit about how this idea for this recent book has come about, Too Good to Be False?
I'm not even sure how the idea comes about for something like this. There are ideas in this book that I cannot trace back to anything, except for back in my days doing strategic planning. One of the things I looked for, or organizational assessment in ministry, one of the things I learned to look for was what isn't there. And I started studying the Gospels looking for what's not there. And specifically, Jesus being a great leader, a great religious leader. What do great religious leaders do? What are they like? What is common about them? And where is Jesus different? The first thing that back then that really struck me, and it totally changed my worship even of Jesus, was realizing that in not just in history, but even in imagination, myth, literature, Marvel movies, there is nobody like Jesus in this sense. There's nobody. There is Jesus, unlike every other character in all history or literature, is unimaginably powerful. You write down a list of all the powerful people that anybody has ever thought about, and you get names like Thanos or Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or Hitler or whoever. And then you think of another list, which is where Jesus really shines, is those who are very, very other-centered, very self-sacrificial, very giving. And you get names like Mother Teresa, Gandhi, or Martin Luther King Jr., or the favorite one I've ever heard anyone mention was Mom. And what you notice about those two lists is that they're not the same. You never, ever encounter someone who has incredible power and uses it in a self-sacrificial way only for others. You never do, except for one person, and that's Jesus. Not only is he the only person to do it, but boy, does he stand out. Power? Superman flies through space. Jesus created space. There's a difference there. Jesus, not only did Jesus give his life freely, he gave it freely in the sense that none of us could give it freely. I could I could choose to die for my wife if I had to, but I cannot choose not to die at all. Jesus could have chosen not to die at all, but he gave his life for us all. You do not find that combination anywhere among any great or other leader. That was the first one that struck me, and I wrote on it. I developed it a little bit, and I thought, okay, I've shot my wad. That's pretty much all there is to say about Jesus' uniqueness. But then when I came back to study for this book later, a whole lot of other similar unique characters of Jesus also came to mind. I had a blast just studying through it and learning and going through that.
Well, I kind of, if I had to summarize the book, it would be something along the lines of, here, you just can't make this stuff up, But how would you kind of briefly summarize, for those who haven't read the book yet, how would you briefly summarize the case overall that you make in the book?
Yeah. So the book's in 3 parts. The third part is application, and it comes down to the title of it is Jesus No Matter What. And the point of it is not just that Jesus is amazing, but that we need to follow him no matter what. But getting there comes in 2 parts. And the first part is a whole series of characteristics of Jesus similar to the one I just mentioned to you that are unexpected, things that you do not see in Jesus that you would think you would see. Like he never says, "Thus says the Lord." He never says, "Our Father," except he tells the disciples to. The most surprising one, and please, if anybody listening to this podcast has ever heard this anywhere else, I want to know about it because I've never heard anybody ever discuss this, ever. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that Jesus had faith. Now, that's shocking. It has meaning, and I go through that in the book. But Jesus leads in a most unique manner. He says, and he builds friends. We all talk about Jesus being our friend, but what kind of a friend says, "You are my friend if you do as I command"? You don't look for friends like that. But Jesus is different. So that's part 1. I show how not only different he is, but consistently throughout all 4 Gospels, the little differences the skeptics talk about are nothing compared to the commonality in things like that. Jesus acting as if he is God, with authority and with consistency and with strength.
Oh, no, I was just going to say one of the things you mentioned that I find fascinating that I will confess that is not something that I had thought of before is, and I'd like to unpack this a little bit just out of interest, was this idea of Jesus not having faith. And I read one of your I read one of your responses to the Unitarian Dale Tuggy. He summarized your argument actually in a way that you found very, very accurate. So you shared it. But I like how you said in there that it's kind of difficult to talk about that because we don't want to say Jesus was faithless because that sounds kind of bad.
No, right.
So what are some things that we can draw from this idea that Jesus really didn't exercise faith in the way that he commanded us to do?
Right. Now, first of all, I need to point out, and I'm not going to go through it here, but there is such a thing as an argument from silence that is invalid. And arguments from silence need some background in order to be made valid. I do that in the book. I won't do it here. Let's just, give me that if you would, please. The fact that the Bible never says Jesus had faith is, I think, significant, pointing out his deity. Faith is trust, but it's not mere trust. It's trust where you are venturing something, where you're putting something maybe at risk. So that, I'd say I have faith, the standard illustration to get on an airplane. I could also say that I trust that I have the ability to scratch my eyebrows. Would I say that? And would I say that I have faith in my ability to scratch my eyebrows? I'm medically able to do it. It would be just a wrong word to use for it. You don't say that. Okay, Jesus did not lack trust in the Father, but to call his relationship with the Father a relationship of faith would be, I think, even more ridiculous than saying that I have faith that I can scratch my eyebrows, because he knew without anything being at ventured, nothing being at risk. He just knew the Father so intimately that it was knowledge beyond faith. Faith includes knowledge, but there are times when knowledge can go beyond faith.
Yeah, I was thinking that it was consistent. What you were arguing there was consistent with this idea that Jesus talks about how he will return to the Father. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if he's actually been with the Father, since before time began, when he comes here, it's not faith to say, "Oh, my Father will do such and such," because he knows his Father. He doesn't require faith. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's how I read it. I mean, the short version is simply that God doesn't have faith in God. That's the short version of it. But that's we can draw that out. But it comes down to that, and it's for Jesus to teach. Jesus taught faith more often than he did love. For him to teach it and not to say, "Here's how you do it. Here's how I have faith. Here's how you follow my model of faith," is striking. And there has to be some reason for it. And I think that's the reason.
Yeah. You know how you read something and you find yourself, like, after you've read it, like walking around when you're doing other things, kind of chewing on it and thinking about it? Yeah. That was me yesterday. I was, and even today, thinking about, like, wow, that's never struck me that he didn't. And then, of course, I found the article on Thinking Christian that you had responded to Dr. Tuggy, and it had that syllogism on there. And I thought, wow, that is so good. So thank you for that. And thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention before, my blog that I've been doing since long before the stream is Thinking Christian at thinkingchristian.net.
Well, another thing is you're mentioning there are the things that you maybe would expect to see, but you don't see, and you're kind of surprised that you're not seeing in them. So in this regard, from a sort of an apologetic standpoint, it's peculiar, and you'd think, well, if skeptics are right in the saying that the Gospels are just sort of cobbled together, they're legendary accretions, and this is something that has been refined and put together over time, you would have maybe expected that if Jesus is teaching about faith, that he would be some sort of exemplar of having faith. But I take it that part of the case that's made in the book is the idea that this is unique, and you couldn't, if you were trying to make it up, you wouldn't have maybe done that. Am I right?
Right. Yeah, and this is not like an ontological argument, and it's not like one YouTube skeptic said that where I'm copying the Muslims' case that the Quran is perfect, therefore it's true. I'm not saying that Jesus' story is perfect, therefore it's true. What I am saying in part 2 of the book, I go in at length into a general description of skeptics' version of where the story of Jesus came from. I start by saying there's 2 things that we can all agree with. One is that the story of Jesus is a story. And the other one is that stories come from somewhere. Stories always come from somewhere. And the backstory that explains where the story comes from ought to be consistent with the story that you get when it's been produced. Well, the skeptics and the Christians both have backstories. We have, as our backstory, is that the story of Jesus is the true account, the true report of the most unique, perfect individual human life ever lived. The skeptic's backstory is that, and here I'm generalizing, cobbling a few things together. Not every skeptic will say every part of this, but that Jesus was, gained an impressive following of people who were impressed with him, had high hopes in him, but he was killed. They were bummed, and they went into a period of cognitive dissonance, which they sought to reduce. The theory, cognitive dissonance theory, says the way you do that is sometimes, in certain circumstances, you will remake reality to fit what you thought was true. It's been done. It's been documented. So that part is at least believable that far in the story. So they said, okay, Jesus didn't fail us. He's actually risen from the dead. He's our Messiah after all. This is the product of confused minds so far. Okay. But that's where they think it started. And then from there, one thing you do when you have this cognitive dissonance thing going on sometimes is you'll go out and you'll convince others to shore up your belief in it. And so they did. They went out proselytizing. and it's spread. It's spread everywhere. It's spread all over the Mediterranean basin. Bart Ehrman, in his books, 3 or 4 of them, I think, he talks about the telephone game, where he insists that we've got not just a telephone game among kids playing it in one kindergarten room, but across multiple languages and religions and countries and cultures. And in one case, he says, what happens to stories when you do that? They change. Well, I look at that and I go, oh, Bart. They don't. Yes, they change, but come on. No, they get absolutely corrupted. They get distorted. They get scrambled. The theory that you get looking at skepticism overall is that the story of Jesus came out of what I call a story scrambler. This cognitive dissonance, bad psychological beginning, flowing through the telephone game, going everywhere, and then finally landing 4 times, 4 different people writing it down and getting it essentially the same. And getting it unexpectedly, essentially the same. So it's not that this is proof that the Bible is true, but I think it's incredibly strong evidence that the skeptic's explanation for where Jesus' story came from is absolutely impossible and unbelievable. They are wrong. They're going to have to come up with something better than that if they're going to avoid the backstory that we have, which is it's a true account of the one perfect life ever lived.
Yeah, I like how you're presenting that, because it so often Christians go on the defensive, right? We always feel like we have to explain, where this is more, to me, I see it in my mind, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, I see it as more of an offensive approach, because we're essentially saying, look, we have these 4 Greco-Roman biographies, and we're going to argue, like, what is the best explanation of this exemplary character that we find in these 4 Gospels? I mean, I imagine that it would be difficult to come up with 1, much less 4. And does the case that I'm presenting make more sense, or does your skeptical explanation make more sense? And I think that is a really interesting way to approach it. Am I understanding that correctly, Tom?
Yeah. Yes, you are. And again, the idea is that the skeptics are relying on this legend theory, this legendary evolution theory, which is bound to produce, take the evolution story from biology. It produces variation over time, and variations get locked in as species and so on. I don't believe in that, by the way, but they do. And there should be variations among the stories that should get locked in as different species. And even though they'll say the Gospel of John is different from the Synoptics, which it is in certain ways, it's not different in the key factors of Jesus' character. He is still the one who has authority, who acts as if he's God in the Sermon on the Mount. My goodness, in the Old Testament, the prophets will say, "Thus says the Lord." Jesus says, "But I say to you." All of the first century, you look at the Talmud, which began to be compiled around the time of Christ, maybe a little later, and it's reference after reference after reference to Rabbi this and Sage that and so on. And Jesus says, "But I say to you." He spoke as if he were a prophet saying, "Thus says the Lord," but he left out the part where he says, "Thus says the Lord." He says, "I say to you." Jesus is acting very much like God in the book of Matthew. And he's acting very much like God in the book of John. It's the same person.
Amen.
I wonder if you've maybe kind of brushed up against this answer in some of the things you've said, but it makes me want to ask the question even more. What do you think, in the feedback you've received about the book, what do you think is the most common misconception about the case you're making? Has it been misconstrued or misunderstood, and how so?
So far, I haven't heard any real feedback from anyone who's heard anything other than interviews. And one of them was that, that I was saying that the story had to be perfect because, or the story had to be true because it was perfect. And that's just not my case. Another one, the one that was funniest, a YouTuber named Paulogia went up. Oh man, he went over and over and over again. He spent minutes on this thing that I'd said in an interview with Frank Turek. I said, one of the crazy things about the story of Jesus is that there is no character growth. He starts out perfect. He starts out perfect and he ends up perfect. His very first sermon ever, at least according to the Matthew timeline, is probably the best sermon ever. You don't get that out of seminary students, by the way. And there is nothing wrong with him ever. And Paul Ogia, he took that and he just ran with it. He said, that's just a Mary Sue. A Mary Sue, I found out then, is a fan fiction character who's too perfect. And he said, Mary Sues are boring. They're bad writing. You don't put a Mary Sue in because nobody's interested in a Mary Sue. You always have to have character growth. And he missed the next step, which, by the way, I wrote exactly the same thing in my book. He made the same point I was making, but he missed the follow-on step, which is, did you notice that Jesus isn't boring? There's something about Jesus' story that has not only been interesting, but it's been interesting enough to have people dying for him 2,000 years later all over the world. It's not a boring character we're looking at here. He's the most compelling character in all history. Now, this is another weird thing about Jesus' story. It shouldn't work on that basis. And my goodness, it does. He's different. And the skeptics think that too, it was just, that was evolution did that too, legend and stuff. No, you don't come up with the most unique character in that sense either by dumb luck.
Yeah. So I was just curious in regard to your case. I mean, the idea of Jesus's moral excellence obviously being central.
Yes.
What would you say? What would you respond to somebody like, say, a Bertrand Russell? Remember he argued in his famous lecture turned into essay, Why I'm Not a Christian. He offers examples that he claims show that Jesus is not an excellent moral character, such as his teaching on hell and the fact that he allowed a group of pigs to be possessed and jump over a cliff. And, the idea was, well, surely these things are not the actions of a exemplary moral individual. I was just wondering how I would imagine that being a common pushback.
Yes. Yeah, I have gotten that one too. Yes.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. Here's the thing about it is that there are disagreements. Jesus didn't say that homosexuality was okay. So he's a moral failure. People have different opinions on what's right. Yeah, actually, to teach on hell is a very bad idea if hell is a lie. But if it's a good warning, it may not be such a bad idea to tell people about it, right? We can disagree on certain things. We can disagree on slavery, homosexuality, hell, and so on. But what we can't miss, I see it as a Bertrand Russell being the man on the beach who's walking along and he looks down and he sees a diamond in a stand, and it's a huge diamond. It's like a half-inch around diamond. How many carats that would be? I don't know. But it's an absolutely huge diamond. And he says, there's a diamond in the sand. Look at all the sand. Jesus you may think there's sand around the life of Jesus. I don't need to argue with you over the sand. I want to look at the diamond. Where did his extraordinary self-sacrificial goodness come from? There is nobody like him. You imagine yourself getting a huge economic win. An uncle dies you never heard of and leaves you $500 million. And you suddenly have power that you never had before. And imagine being the best person ever on earth, save Jesus. And you think, I am going to give it all away. I'm going to give it all to missions. I'm going to give it to feeding the poor. I'm going to give it to ending sex trafficking. I'm going to give it to all the right things. I'm going to give it all away. Would you get the brakes fixed? Would you take your wife out to dinner or have do a nice vacation? Would you give it all away? Jesus never used his extraordinary power for his own benefit. Not even when he was really, really hungry. And the devil was right. He could have turned that stone into bread. He could have done that. I look at that and I try to imagine myself being that good in it. And it has actually many times just forced me face down on the ground, crying out, "You are my Lord." You are my God.
Mm.
And this is a diamond. This one fact alone is a good thing about Jesus that is absolutely unequaled. And if you can explain that, Bertrand Russell, good luck. Where did that come from?
I think I like what you're saying as far as, it's almost like if I got a box, I found this huge box and it had this huge chunk of gold in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it had all these little pieces of fool's gold. And I, of course, chose to complain about the 2 or 3 pieces of fool's gold instead of focusing on the fact that I have this giant nugget of gold.
Yeah,
right.
The same thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So one objection that Brian thought of is, and he calls it the Facebook objection. And it goes something like this. Jesus's life isn't really that great because, like Facebook, of course, you only hear kind of the good stories about people's lives. And this is the same with Jesus. We only hear these good stories. So when you say he has this awesome moral character, or he never did this, or he never said anything wrong, it's kind of just reporting bias.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
Well, a couple of things. One is that Jesus' goodness isn't normal goodness. It's the goodness of someone who's acting like God and who says things like, you would not put this on Facebook. Oh, man, he's such a great friend. He is an amazing friend. And he says, you can be my friends, too, if you'll do what I command. That's not normally good. You don't do that. Jesus' goodness is different. Mm-hmm. And so he's different in multiple ways. He's extraordinary in ways that that nobody on Facebook came up with someone who is as powerful and as loving as Jesus. This is goodness beyond whitewashing. This is not just someone whose bad characteristics have been wiped off the map. This is someone who is self-sacrificial beyond compare. This is it's also unexpected goodness in other ways. Jesus, as a leader, he does things that you don't expect of a leader. Normally, you would not want a boss who never asked you your opinion except to tell you how you were wrong. Normally, you wouldn't want a boss who didn't learn from his mistakes. And Jesus was the wrong kind of boss in all kinds of ways. He should have been a failed leader. He wasn't. Something else about him was so incredibly out of the ordinary that it overcame what I, in my studies, my grad studies in organizational psychology, would say is necessary in order to be an effective leader. It's consistent goodness. It's consistent in the sense that if you had people making up stories about you from across the webiverse, and to have them come out as similar as they did for Jesus in the 4 accounts we have, that is also unexpected. So this is not like a whitewashed Facebook experience. This is a person who is more positively and unexpectedly good than anybody that you would try to produce by making him look good.
That's a great point. And I'm also thinking, too, as I think about kind of this Facebook objection that I think is fun to think about, is also there are things recorded in the New Testament that people, and you hinted at this, that people wouldn't put on Facebook, right?
Yeah.
For example, when Jesus outright admits, now this isn't necessarily due to his moral character, but passages in there about him saying, no one knows but the Father, not even the Son knows.
Right.
Well, I mean, if you're making this story up to not only make him look like an exemplary moral person, but also to make him look like he's God, because the whole thing is legendary, well, then that's not something you're going to leave in there, right?
Right. So it just doesn't fit the Facebook whitewash character theory at all. He's not that kind of a character.
Part of the great thing about the book is just its focus on Jesus. And some people have said, this is a book that, exalts Jesus, and it's sort of like increases your worship towards him by reading it. And there's been some recent and very good praise that you've received about the book, and I hope you wouldn't mind sharing that with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you. For me, it was a worship experience. I've already mentioned that. My favorite endorsement of all came from J.P. Moreland, who is one of my two living intellectual heroes, along with Josh McDowell, who had a lot to do with my early apologetic experience, even coming to Christ. But he said, the book's brilliance lies in the approach of arguing for Jesus' uniqueness and deity based on what Jesus did not do. I have never approached the Gospels in this way, and with Gilson's guidance, I have come to love, respect, and worship Jesus with renewed vigor and insight. That just made me, I just love it when people have a different encounter with Christ. Not just that he's true, but that he's worthy of worship. He's that great. Just yesterday, and granted, he's a friend and a colleague, writes with me at the Stream, but John Zamirak, author, columnist, said that he considered this the best book on Jesus' character since G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man, which was written in the 1920s.
Wow.
This approach to the study of Jesus has not been published, to my knowledge, since the 1920s. I don't know why we've lost it, and I hope we can get it back and everybody can talk about Jesus, on these terms. Both Sean McDowell, Frank Turek said, this is surprising. Did you think that anybody could say something new about Jesus after 2,000 years? Tom Gilson has. And I'm blown away. It's like, who, me? But it's,
wow.
And by the way, when you think of writing something new about Jesus, you want to get a lot of people's confirmation that you haven't said something new and cultish or new and heretical. This is not cultish. This is not heretical. This is the same Jesus. But since I'm looking at him from a different angle, what didn't he do? I'm seeing different things than we've seen before.
Yeah, I wanted to add just a couple things. First of all, I wanted to just commend to listeners someone like New Testament scholar Craig Evans. I think I may have said this in the introduction, but he's actually said about this book that it's written for laymen, but at the same time, specialists and experts will also get something out of it. So that's definitely a unique approach that you're taking if you're reaching both of those parties. Secondly, I was just going to say that anything that increases our worship and draws us closer to Christ is well worth our time.
And I want listeners to know too that what we've been saying, what I've been saying about especially the chapter on Jesus' unique power and love. I have that chapter available for free for download. If you go to thinkingchristian.net, and just look for a subscribe button, you can subscribe for my email updates, and you can download for free that chapter of the book and read it at your leisure. And I hope you consider from there reading the rest of the book. But I'd like to at least have you go to thinkingchristian.net, find the download, and sign up and enjoy that chapter at least. Get a taste of him that way.
Now, Tom, I know the Kindle version is just recently come out.
Yes.
What about the Audible version? Is that on the horizon as well?
Oh, my gosh. Brian, this has been a crazy year.
Should I not ask?
I recorded the Audible version months ago, and I know how to edit it. But in those months intervening, I have had some health problems. My dad went through a extended sickness and died. I've had another set of health problems. I've also been studying what I learned this year. Honestly, this is for other authors mostly. What I learned is that I knew how to write a book, but I didn't know how to get the word out about a book. And I've spent hours and hours studying how do you tell people about a book so that they'll be interested and at least know about it and buy it. The upshot of that has been that getting the Audible version finished has been on the back shelf forever. It'll come in the next few months. It's not here yet. Authors, don't do what I did. Don't write the book and then figure out whether you know how to sell it. Study how to sell a book too. That's just a little aside for those of you who are in the same biz.
I just wanted to ask for listeners who want to learn more about your book, about your work, where can they find your stuff?
My most frequent daily almost work is at the Stream, stream.org. I strongly commend it to you. Anyone who wants to understand what's going on in the world, we have an incredible team of writers and editors there. So stream.org. To know about the book specifically, go to thinkingchristian.net, which is the blog I've been running for 16, 17 years. And you'll find the information about the book, endorsements, and so on, and also the link to download the sample chapter at thinkingchristian.net.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Picture yourself here. White sugar sand beach, clear blue-green water. This is Pensacola. It's the way to beach. Experience what's waiting at visitpensacola.com.